Greetings. The following is a production of the Greensboro and Charlotte Scottish Rite Valleys. The opinions expressed here are those of the hosts and the host alone, and in no way reflect the opinions of the Greensboro or Scottish Rite Valleys or the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite as a whole. Hope you enjoy the show.
Welcome back, and now we're going to talk about the esoteric lessons, and they're going to be, I'm going to run through 8 of them real quick, and we'll talk about them. The concept of the ever-blossoming and expanding nature of the degrees, I call that wheels within wheels. Alchemy and the change states in INRI, we'll kind of group all that together. The concept of good and evil. Who is your conductor? Who does he represent in this degree? The rose and the cross, the pelican and the eagle, the new law of love, and then we're going to work in niter and dew somewhere, that we may just throw that into one of these as we get to it. So we'll get there. So let's just start off with this concept of the ever-expanding nature of the degrees. You know, symbolically, we talk about in middle chamber a lot the fact that we start in the lodge, and then there's a part where we mention the tabernacle briefly, and then we go to the grander idea, more noble idea of the temple. And, you know, as we go through these degrees, we're always building, and then we discover or we complete the building process or whatever the storyline is. But then it seems to start all over again. It does that in this degree. The working tools are broken, the columns are shattered, and it seems like, well, we just built the whole thing. Why are we all of a sudden back in this state of despair? And to me, the lesson is that, you know, life gives you a lesson to learn, or a thing to learn, or a thing to attain, or a way to become, or something, some challenge in life. And as you work through that challenge, then there's another challenge, and that challenge kind of builds on the last one in a way, but it still has to start from humble beginnings and build up to whatever grand thing that it's going to be. Am I off base here?
No, you're not. There's something in Journey of the Elu to Enlightenment, and now that I know Chuck was instrumental in some of, you know, particularly this degree, I don't know if this was more Bob's words or yours or someone else's, but the concept that as you grow morally, ethically, spiritually, you change. You are a different person. So the idea that there is a new cycle, it shouldn't be that strange, because as you grow and change, there are new opportunities for you to approach, in many ways, the same problem, the same challenge or opportunity, however you want to think about it, in a different way, because you aren't the same that you were prior to that last cycle.
And when you're really switched in, to me, when you're really switched, after you've done this work for a while, then you start to see the patterns in it. So, you know, when I was new doing this work, it was hard to see that, yep, this is just the beginning of a new cycle. And so now I kind of know how they go. I can recognize where I am in those cycles a lot better than I used to could.
Yeah.
You-
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, but I just wanted to speak very specifically to something we talked about earlier in charity. So thinking about like the cycles of your personal growth, a brother enters the fraternity, and maybe his initial thought around charity is, I'm going to donate money to the children's home. Okay, that's their starting point, and maybe they're comfortable with it, maybe they're not, and then it's, well, maybe it's not just writing a check. Maybe I need to give my time. Maybe I need to volunteer. But then from there's another growth where charity is not just about the gift of money or materials, but the gift of what? The gift of love, the gift of understanding, the gift of kindness. It's the same problem. You're introduced to it, but as you grow, the way you react to it, the actual action of charity also changes.
Yeah, and I think, like, you know, these aren't nice cycles in the degrees. We're talking about the destruction of the most holy thing that they've built, right? Their entire reason for being, really. And I think that in addition to what Sean said, that I agree with completely, this idea that the dark night of the soul is not necessarily a once in a lifetime thing, right? In fact, it probably will not be. And that there are these cycles of not just change and not just it being different places of building new things and tearing them down, but also loss and destruction, right? I mean, the tower crumbling down, plans that went awry, and then what do you do at that next stage of darkness, right? Like we see in the apartment of this degree, but continue to look for those constellations of faith, hope, and charity that guide you into right action. But I think, again, like these are universal truths that we can boil down to very specific things in our life or things that affect the whole world, right? So, I mean, this is a micro and macrocosm in action, I think, right? This idea of destruction and rebirth.
Yeah, destruction is just necessary. If we look at it from the macrocosmic point of view, the idea of creation being a finite expression of the infinite being God, right? The infinite, the ineffable. You know, we were talking earlier between tapings here, between recordings, about not being able to really conceptualize God. We can have concepts about God, but those concepts will never really capture what God is. And so if as this degree teaches and as Masonry embraces from the Blue Lodge all the way through, if nature is an expression of the divine, of the infinite, it's a finite expression. And the finite can never capture the infinite.
Right.
And so why destruction is part of nature is so that you can have that constant change and the infinite can emerge in new ways, express itself in new ways. The divine can keep showing up in new and different ways. And so that's the kind of the macrocosmic expression of this dynamic and why destruction is necessary. And then on the microcosmic expression, it's everything that I think that I am, I have to be willing to let go of in order to become what I have the potential to become.
Yes.
If I try to, at some point in my life, say, this is it, this is who and what I am, I'm not going to change, I've made up my mind, then from that point on, I've stopped growing. I've actually stopped living. We are meant to be beings of becoming. I know that's an odd kind of play on words. Beings of becoming, that we're constantly changing. And I could go on and talk about the Tetragrammaton at this point, but I'll not jump down that rabbit hole.
I mean, it's so important, the concept that if you're not changing, then you're just static. I mean, a lot of my friends from, back in the day are the same guys they were then. They're just older, but, they still have the same hobbies and the same way they act. And it's the reason that we tell initiates that, hey, look, be prepared when you do this. You're going to outgrow a lot of the people around you that are not walking the same path that you are, and just be prepared for that. So it's good that you're changing.
And be prepared to become somebody that in one time of your life you would not have approved of.
That's right.
Right, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a universal truth for you. Let's move on to just the general. I kind of lump these together, these stages of change, alchemy and Enrai. I have 5 different explanations of Enrai in a chart in the front of my book. I will spare everybody reading all of them.
And we have to be careful about one in particular.
One in particular.
Okay, well, I'm going to put y'all on that in a second. I mean, having those different explanations, though, to me is not so different than just not being a Christian degree, that everybody can kind of participate in it because you can look at it from these different angles. Just some of the alchemical things thrown into this degree are the cap colors. They talk about this during one of the lectures of black, red, and white that we're so familiar with in Scottish Rite. The apartments themselves, there's the dark one, and then kind of the hell scene is kind of red, and then it goes to a white, there's really bright white scene at the end. So Chuck, I think we should just have you lead off with this, since this seems to be your area of expertise, and and then we'll all jump in.
Well, where did you want me to begin there in particular? Was there a specific spot with that you wanted me to take off on?
I think I would just start with the INRI.
Okay.
Some of the names.
Yeah,
Let's talk.
okay.
Well, since we brought it up, let's talk about this one that we're supposed to avoid first, and then we'll talk about the ones that we're supposed to get to. And I see this as an amalgamation of the ones that I've seen, the programs I've seen you do before. The Rose and the Cross and the. We can mash all these up together.
Okay.
The Rose and the Cross and the.
So without going into detail and certainly not sharing what's said in ritual about INRI, the Masonic secret version of what those letters stand for, that acronym stands for, is basically a summation of this idea that we've been talking about, nature revealing the divine and how that happens. So that points in the direction of one of the understandings of INRI that Pike was a real fan of, and I think he got this from, he may have gotten this from Eliphas Levi, and that is that each of the letters represents one of the four classical elements. Mm-hmm. So you'd have Yebeshah, which represents the element of earth. That's not the literal translation from Hebrew, but that's what it represents. I think Yebeshah essentially means like soil or dirt. And then In is Nor, and that means a lamp or a light, and it represents fire. The R stands for Ruach, which means breath, and so it therefore stands for air. It can also mean spirit. But breath is the way, air is the way it's used there. And then the last one is Yam or Yamim, which Yam and Yamim have to do with the sea or the seas, and so you have the water connection there. And you have those four elements. And this is an ancient way of understanding some of the basic principles at work in nature, these four elements, earth, water, air, and fire. And instead of taking them literally as earth being like soil and stone and that sort of thing, and water is actually being liquid H2O. Instead of taking it literally, one way of understanding that is states of matter, right? But this is just an example for ways that we can use that symbolism of earth, water, air, and fire as to giving us insight about nature. They also can give us insight about human nature, about our psychology, our consciousness, and now we're getting into the esoteric, the internal. That's what esoteric means, that which is within. In that each of those four elements can represent a different aspect of the human soul, the way we experience life and respond to life. So the earth being the physical part of our being, and the water relating to our emotions and to the unconscious, the subterranean kind of movement of forces within our psyche and so on that show up so often through our emotions. And the breath, the air, being like the intellect, and how expansive it can be, and also how flighty it can be sometimes, right? And the fire relating to that volitional aspect of ourselves, the will, the desire to get things done, right? It's not necessarily an emotional kind of thing. That kind of fire is just the drive to make things happen, which then stimulates emotion, certainly, but it also stimulates thought and it stimulates action. So fire then representing that volitional, willful aspect of our being. And the cross, so Pike has this actually in Morals and Dogma. You can see this cross of the four elements. And what he's doing, that I know he borrowed from Eliphas Levi, he's showing that what the cross represents is these four elements in harmony with each other. That your physical being, your emotional being, your intellectual being and your willful being, your will, are all in harmony and working together rather than being in opposition. And it's easy for these things to be in opposition. We all know this from our personal experience. Just think about your intellectual side, that airy part of you, and your physical being, this physical part of you. Does your body always do what your mind wants it to do? No. And does your body sometimes make it hard for you to use your intellect the way you want to? Well, if you haven't been eating properly, if you've been abusing your bodies in some way, it dang sure can. And so there's an opposition there. And another opposition is between fire and water. And we can look at that literally and say, yes, fire can turn water into steam and water can extinguish fire. So there's an opposition there. Well, if fire and water represent the volitional part of us and the emotional part of us, you can see how those can get into conflict. If you've got the will to do something, but you don't have the emotional energy moving in that direction, if your emotions are going in a different direction, then you won't be able to accomplish your goal. How many of us have said, I'm going to stop doing such and such because I know it's no good for me? And there's a statement of will there, right? And yet, we've got an emotional attachment to doing it, so we keep doing it.
Yeah.
So what the cross of the four elements, when we look at Enri and we look at the rose cross as being a symbol of those elements in harmony with each other, then the rose itself emerges as the beautiful image of what a life can be like when we've got all four of those parts of ourselves working together in harmony. Yeah.
We'll go with that.
I'm good with that.
What's the one we're supposed to be careful of? The explanation we're supposed to be careful of.
Oh, the one that I started with and said it summarizes what we were saying about finding, about looking to nature to reveal to us truths about the divine.
Mm-hmm.
And I went from there into the four elements because there's a connection of working with nature there.
You just want to get us in trouble, Ben. That's it.
Don't get us in trouble.
I don't really understand what we're talking about there. Okay.
But I can make a connection now. You really wanted to hear about the dew and the niter.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a good connection here with that. So the rose then emerges as this beautiful representation of these four elements working together in harmony. Well, one of the things that has been speculated by some scholars about Rosicrucianism is that Rose Cross or Rose Croix or Rose Croix, that the Latin rosa is concealing the Latin ros, R-O-S. And ros is the Latin word for dew. Now, if you look at from an alchemical perspective, and also, by the way, in some of our biblical literature and in the rabbinic literature of the Kabbalah, in the Zohar, you can find this. Dew is used as a symbol for this essential life-giving element delivered from God, from the heavens, that forms when the conditions of temperature and humidity are just right. We know how that dew is. That's considered, that actual experience of dew is considered metaphorical for the essence of life being provided from the heavens. Okay? So what they're saying then is that if the rose is ros, rosa is ros, then the rose represents this essential element of life now being more directly apparent, made more directly apparent. And having been made apparent because of the other elements of our body, of our being brought into harmony with each other. Now, the alchemists said that within this essence that's metaphorically represented as dew, is sometimes called azoth by the alchemists, which doesn't mean do, but is another name for this essential element, this one thing, this quintessence from which all other elements arise, which is also called ether or spirit. That it has within it two basic natures. There's a duality inherent within the one, quintessence. And one of those is called niter, and one is called salt. So two really basic things that are necessary for the chemical operations that alchemists would do, particularly in transforming metals, in refining metals, extracting metals from ore, and so on. Niter is a fluxing agent. It makes it possible to remove the impurities and to draw out the metal that you want from the ore. It also, niter, makes it possible to take two metals and bring them together. It's a fluxing agent. So anybody that watches that show Forged in Fire, where they're trying to make a billet for a knife and they're doing Damascus and they're putting two different pieces of metal together and they sprinkle that white powder on there, that's niter that they're putting on there to get the equivalent of niter that they're putting on there to get those metals to bond together more effectively and become one thing. So that's the active, transformative, dynamic aspect of dew. The other aspect, represented by salt, is the passive, nurturing kind of element. The reason we put attention on niter is because it can be consciously used to transform things, to make things change in a way that we desire them to change. And that's what masonry is about. That's what alchemy is about, is transforming things from one state into another state. In the kind of ancient way of thinking about alchemy, it was trying to discover the secret of making gold. And from a spiritual perspective, what that means is making yourself more in tune, more harmonized with the divine, a more living expression of the divine, conscious, intentional, cooperative expression of the divine. So, one of the translations or explanations of the acronym of INRI is Igne Nitrum Roris Invenitur. And what that means is Igne is fire, Nitrum is niter, Roris is dew, Invenitur means to uncover, to discover, to reveal. What that acronym now says is that the niter of dew is revealed by fire. And that fire is our will, our desire. That if we want to find that quintessential element of dew and within it find the dynamic transformative potential, that which we need in order to change and become more spiritual, conscious beings, then we have to want that. We have to desire it. We have to focus our will on it. And so that's where the niter and the dew and that translation of INRI is important to us in this degree. Now, there's a connection here too with the cubic stone, because we're told that the cubic stone sweats blood and water. The cubic stone, from a alchemical perspective, represents the quintessential matter, the prima materia, the perfect raw material, right there in its one perfect state. But it sweats blood and water. Blood representing the active, life-giving, transformative power, and water representing that more passive kind of thing that would be associated with the salt. And so you can see that the cubic stone has the potential, the same potentials within it that the rose with the four elements combined as dew, having those two potentials within it now at a transformed state. Because what do we show in the 18th degree? The cubic stone becomes the mystic rose. And so that's because that active transformative potential that we call niter has been embraced, has been used, and now this raw material that's represented by the stone has been transformed into a living, beautiful expression of the divine. That's us. That stone is the ashlar that we're taught in the first degree is us. And in the 18th degree, we transform that stone into a rose.
Now spin Christ into that story.
Well, Christ is the exemplar, and clearly made so in this degree, that Jesus is the exemplar. But it alludes to a kind of universal Christ. Christ originally in the Greek means anointed, and it was a term used for anyone who had recognized their divinity, that their oneness with God. It wasn't just strictly reserved for Jesus. Now in Christianity, we look to Jesus as being a special incarnation of the divine. And we hold him up as the primary model of that kind of existence in life, of being one with God. Jesus repeatedly says, I and my Father are one. In chapter 17 of the Gospel of John, he says he wants his followers and his followers' followers to know that same unity. He wants them to be with God where he is, in the same way that he is one with God. He wants that for his followers. And so the rose blossoming on the cross is the risen Jesus, but represents also the opportunity of Christ awakening within us, like the Apostle Paul talks about. It's no longer me, but it's Christ in me. I now recognize that it is God that is my life, that is my essence, and I need to get out of the way of that. I, Chuck Dunning, am just a mask on that. And that's not the important part. What's important is what's behind that mask, the light and essence of the divine. And that is expressed most purely through love. And that's why Jesus is such an important part of this degree, and why he has such an important place in history, period, regardless of what religion you follow, is because he was preaching that love is the way to recognize not only your own connection with the divine, but everybody else's connection with the divine too. That we're all children of the same God. We're all expressions of the same divinity.
Thus endeth the lesson.
Yeah. Nothing to add to that.
Nothing to add to that. Let's talk about good and evil, because it plays a pretty prevalent role in the lectures in this degree. So one of the questions they ask in the degree, I've already read this once, but if God is omnipotent, I don't think we did read this. If God is omnipotent, he could have prevented the existence of these evils. Why does he allow them to exist? I'm just going to read all these quotes and we'll talk about it. There are two distinct powers in the universe, one of evil and one of good, ever warring against each other with varied fortunes. Out of these questions chiefly grew the old philosophies and the old religions. Men could not believe that evil was ultimately to conquer. Men could not believe that evil was ultimately to conquer. For then evil would be God in the will of God, they said, was the only foundation of the moral law. And so with that, evil's victory, vice would become a duty, and the virtues would become crimes. And thus the antagonism of the good and evil principles and the necessity of certainty of the coming at some time of a warrior, a hero, a Messiah, a Savior, or a Redeemer who should conquer and destroy the principle of all evil. I'm gonna leave that last one off. I think having read all this about the good and evil, Pike talks about it very extensively. I think what they're saying is that some people believe, that good and evil are eternally warring, and that one of them is going to ultimately win. But we, as Masons, have to have faith in the concept that good is going to ultimately be the victor in that. That the universe is eventually going to curve towards the good, in it, that it's, I don't know if it's predestined that that's going to happen, but that's we have to have faith that that's going to happen. Because if not, what do we have faith in?
Right.
To sort of tie that question back to the interpretation of Enrod, there's the one specific one that is of an esoteric nature that we can't say, but the concept there is how might we as rational beings reason that ultimately good will prevail. And the idea is when we look to nature and we see the cycles, we see the harmony that exists within nature, despite however you want to define evil in the natural world, outside of man's presence in the world. Whether it's the lion or tiger devouring the gazelle, or from whose perspective you take, or the lightning that causes the forest to burn down, and so many others. There we see within nature there are constant cycles of we talked earlier, creation, sustaining, and then destruction, but not destruction to be done, destruction to recreate, regenerate. That the cycle is one of continuous progress. And so back to that interpretation, I think where it's going is as Masons, we are to look to nature and see that regenerative cycle, that progress that's made, and from that reason that ultimately God is love, that good will prevail, and that we ourselves have that same ability to regenerate into a better person through those same cycles that our degrees are really pointing us to, that as we discussed earlier.
Yeah, I mean, this is like a tall order, right? Talking about the justification of why evil exists. I mean, it's a perennial issue that all religions have struggled with.
It's the great enigma that we start out in the degree.
100%. But I think it was in the 17th degree, we talked about how there was something inherently about good that would lead it to prevail against evil. That good can stand on its own, but evil is only defined by its opposition to good. And therefore, if there was no good, there could be no evil. But you could have evil without, you could have good without evil. You see what I'm saying? I think it was the 17th degree that we talked about that in. And, I think, because, we can talk about the sort of ebb and flow of creation and destruction, right? Like just the change of the seasons, and we can see all of that. But there is cruelty and unfairness in the world that falls outside of what is natural by our definition, right? And that's the thing that I think, we can posit and we can philosophize on some of this stuff and come up with some answers about why. But this has been one of the hardest questions for human beings to answer: is why do certain things happen? And why would an all-powerful God allow that to happen?
Right. Yes, it is such a powerful question, and it reaches into such ineffable heights that one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is it more important for me to try to come up with an intellectual solution to this problem, or is it more important for me to think about how I'm going to respond to this problem, how I'm going to deal with this fact of life. And that's where I think the new law of love comes in, is that's you can look at the new law of love as an explanation about how this problem can be understood at that 30,000-foot level, and how it is that good may always triumph, and why it is that we must have destruction and death and all those things. You can do that. You can do that with love, but more importantly, what you do with love is understand that it's the only thing that allows us to actually live with that horrible reality that you're talking about.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That's absolutely right.
What do y'all think the conductor, the master of ceremonies, represents in this degree? In the manuscript, one of the older ones that we were referencing earlier, called An Ancient Manuscript in French without date, there's a catechism going on. So this is one of the really old ones. It's not in our current ritual. In the catechism it says, "Whence came you?" "From Judea." I'm okay to quote this, right? It's in the book.
Yeah, it's
It's in
Right.
print.
yeah.
"Through what place have you passed?" Answer is Nazareth. "Who is your conductor?" "Raphael." "What tribe are you?" "Judah." Who is this conductor figure? I mean, if you look at, we teach in middle chamber, there's the lodge is a model of consciousness. So we assign, McNulty assigns aspects to each of the characters, the lodge officers, the characters in the play. If you parlay that into the Scottish Rite stuff, the drama. What aspect of us is this guide? I mean, it's probably the same aspect as the senior deacon, but it's who's a guide, the guy that guides you around, and is the representative of spirit in the Blue Lodge. We call him the spirit guide sometimes, kind of half tongue in cheek, but I mean, it kind of applies in the Blue Lodge. This is kind of the same. Is this an aspect of your higher self that resides? Is this the part of you that never dies? Is this a different entity altogether? What do you think?
Well, I think it can be any of those things, and you can find meaning in any of those things. Speaking for myself personally, I think it's interesting that the naming in that version of the ritual as Raphael, well, that's the name of an archangel, and it's the archangel of healing. And a lot of what we are talking about is healing the soul, reintegrating the soul, transforming the soul, so that we can become a more willing, active, intentional, more conscious participant with the divine here in this world. That's a healing process. And then we become a more healing presence to the world around us. So the idea of naming it Raphael seems perfectly fitting to me, that guide would be Raphael. Now, the fact that Raphael is an archangel is just that in itself is very interesting, because in a Kabbalistic way of looking at the soul, there are different aspects of the soul for the different levels of manifestation. God emanates creation, and so there's a kind of set of layers between the pure, ineffable deity and the world as we know it. Heavens, you can think of them as a series of heavens, right? And at the highest level, just beneath the Godhead, the ineffable Godhead, the thing that we can't understand, that the Kabbalists called Ein Sof, beneath that is a level where the different names of God just kind of express the different attributes of the divine. Each different way of naming God in the Hebrew religion. There's all of these different names. That's also true in Islam. That there are different names for deity, and each one of those names represents a different divine attribute. But just beneath that, then, is where you find the archangels. The next layer down is where you find the archangels. Now, the human soul is said to span all of those levels, that ultimately we connect directly with the spark of the divine. That's the spiritual seed within each of us, that spark of the divine, represented by the Hebrew letter Yud in the triangle on the agate stone that we deal with in the 13th and 14th degree, that spark. So the human soul spans that whole continuum. What we call in esoteric Christianity the holy guardian angel exists at that level, is said in many traditions to exist at that level. And in many of these traditions, that holy guardian angel is a higher aspect of ourself. It's not a separate entity. But that's a part of us that sees our life and guides our life from that 30,000 foot level that we were kind of talking about earlier, from that higher, more divine state, and is working and using us as a working tool in this world of physicality, of social existence, and so on. And so our guide then would be that aspect of our soul, that part of us which is just below the divine names, the different names that God is given to express the different attributes of the divine. But is at that archangelic level where we start to see some differentiation now into particular kinds of characters, right, that manifest throughout. You might think of them as the archetypes. Sometimes we talk about the archetypes. That of human existence, right? That those and the archangels, you can think of them as being very similar to each other. And so at some point up there, there's an aspect of my soul that is working to express something through me and my actions here in this world, and also to experience things through me and my presence in this world. And because there's that back and forth flow, that, you know.
Yeah.
And so, yes, our guide is an aspect of ourselves that is so removed from our ordinary daily consciousness that it can seem like another being. That voice of intuition sometimes that speaks to us and says, you know, you just know, oh, I've got to do this, whatever it is.
Or not do this.
Or not do this, right. Or you get that spark of insight about what something means when we're examining Masonic symbolism, and you go, oh, you didn't think it, right? It's not the result of some chain of reasoning that you did. It popped in out of somewhere.
Yeah.
So that guide, that higher aspect of ourself, that archangelic aspect of ourself, can definitely seem like a different being.
Okay, let me throw a quote in here, just because this is exactly what you just said. This is from the liturgy. You're talking about Jesus, not groveling in intellect. He taught only that learning which enables one to do that may come from elsewhere other than books. And then he said Socrates did not stuff his discourses with quotations. He's talking about that insight that comes from elsewhere. That's what he says.
Yeah.
And that is that intuition that comes from this guide that we do have access to. I mean, not just in the degree, we have access to that messaging.
Yes.
All the time if we'll listen to it.
And that brings us right back to what Noah was talking about sackcloth and ashes.
Yeah.
Is that me, this presence here in this world, has to humble itself and recognize it's just a small little part way down here at the bottom of the soul. And once it recognizes that, then it has the opportunity to listen.
Yeah.
And respond to what it receives from this higher voice. Just like the candidate does when he's hoodwinked.
Yes.
And he doesn't know what to say, but the voice tells him what to say.
Right. And is guiding him.
Yes.
And is lifting his veil occasionally.
Occasionally lifting his veil.
In the 18th is also lifting the veil. I was going back to like the Blue Lodge. And McNulty's whatever conceptualization of the officers, the senior deacon is intuition. That point. I point of clarification, and I think I know what the answer is, but just to be clear, if I understood you correctly, that higher aspect of yourself may take on the various characteristics that we assign to the archangels. So the archangels are not separate things; they are different aspects of that higher self. Is that what you were saying?
No, that's not what I was saying, but you could look at it, you could certainly look at it that way. No, what I'm saying is that aspect of ourself exists at the same level as the archangels.
Okay, all right.
According to a certain way of esoteric
Sure,
thought.
sure.
Yeah, this is not a Masonic teaching. This is the perspective on Masonic
right,
teaching.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Might be good to make that clarification somewhere in there.
About every 5 minutes, probably. We should do that, yeah.
You just need to have it flash up on the screen.
Yeah.
But what Chuck just talks about, letting our ego step to the side so that we can get that connection going. I mean, that one of the big symbols in this degree is sacrifice.
Yes.
Right. The importance of sacrifice and how sacrifice leads to the new life. And I think, it's important to note how distressing it can be to have a realization that you're not who you think you are, right? That
Oh, man.
my titles and accolades and my life's accomplishments and my family, my name, my reputation, that ultimately all that stuff is a construct, right? That's not me on a core level. And that is a very, very, very uncomfortable thing, particularly for us as Westerners, when we have such an individualistic way of looking at ourselves and such a sense of self-importance of the things that we've accomplished. And but I think it's absolutely necessary, right? And it also leads to a better way of life because, I can't take myself too seriously if I understand that my ego is a construct, right? Now I'm not there, obviously, right? I have not arrived, but I think like that, we're talking about all this good, pleasant stuff, like being in contact with your higher self and, pangs of constructive intuition. But like, again, like we talked about at the beginning of this video, like that oftentimes is very, very painful.
Yes.
And that's the hill scene.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
In the
it's the opening scene,
Yeah.
right? It's the opening scene is, take the opening scene, the first apartment. It is like one of the most depressing parts of any Masonic degree we have, right? I mean, it's intentionally so. Right. You play it up that way.
like 4.
Right. Yeah, there's an intent to build that emotion in the candidate of that level of depression because the columns are broken. Jacob and Boaz are broken. Where's your sense of balance if you don't have the guideposts where you should be? You've lost your way. The working tools, the means by which you would even test or the actions you might take, they're broken. You don't know what to do. This is a sense that you're at a point in your life, you don't know who you are. Right?
Right.
Like, there was an ego. There is an ego. And now, shoot. Who am I?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right?
And 17 has set all this up for us.
And you may
beautifully.
even have people around you saying, "Who are you?"
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You may get it internally, externally.
Yeah.
And you know what? You probably see this. This is what your counsel on, I'm sure, is like, well, we just try to put on the best face we can and pretend. But we're struggling, man. But the degree is saying this is a cycle. Guess what? I mean, it's going to be painful, right? Yes, it will feel cruel at times.
Yes.
But there is a path. There are the constellations give us a light on a path to a different place.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, guess what? It's just another cycle. You're going to go through it again.
But you got to accept it when you're in that phase.
yes,
When you're in
yes,
that phase,
yes.
that's what Christ did. I mean, he accepted. He could have fought it, but he didn't. You've got to accept that downfall that you're going through.
Exactly, and I'm glad you brought Christ up, because at the end of this degree, there's this long review of the story of Jesus, right? And at least the way we do it in Guthrie.
I was going to say.
I don't think.
Yeah, there's in Guthrie, we talk about, it's basically a review of the story of Jesus and talking about him recognizing the sacrifice he had to make. And look at the New Testament account of the Garden of Gethsemane. There's no clearer expression of Jesus' humanity, being face down in the dirt, sweating blood, crying, asking to be spared this cup. Nevertheless, thy will be done, not mine. And in the ritual that we do in Guthrie, and I think I've heard this in other valleys too, there's this beautiful expression. He was reluctant to die, but willing to do so. And the reason he was willing to do so was because he loved God and he loved humanity. And he knew that the sacrifice had to be made. He was a human being who had an ego. We talk a lot about how he was divine, and he said, I and my Father are one. He knew. He was Christ. He knew his oneness with the divine, but he was also still human. Didn't want to die, didn't want it to happen, but he knew it had to happen in order for something bigger and better to be brought into the world. And here we are talking about him.
And Jesus wept.
Yeah, right. And so, I mean, this is what we all have to do. Take up that cross.
Yeah. Next. I don't know what to say after that. You got anything?
No, I think that's pretty much all there is to say about that.
I think we'll just skip the rose and the cross. I think we pretty much covered that.
Yeah, pretty thoroughly.
Pelican and the eagle?
Talked about it earlier, right? The eagle is the symbol of the, the sacrifice made for the greater good, right? I mean, the pelican plucking her breast open to feed her young. There's pretty obvious parallels with Christ dying for the salvation of all humanity there, right, on a surface level.
Yeah, and Rex also attributes the pelican to nature. So, a symbol can mean more than one thing, right? They can represent multiple things.
There's great alchemical symbolism with the pelican and eagle, too. The pelican is actually a vessel used in alchemy for the refining and distilling of an essence to get it purer and purer and purer, to then be used as a medicine, for example, for others. And so that nicely ties in with the pelican tearing its own breast to feed the chicks. And the eagle represents something that has been sublimated. So sublimation is an operation in which you heat a chemical or an element of some sort, and it releases, like evaporation, it releases some essence of itself, and then you capture that. And so the eagle then represents that which has been released. Think of it as the phoenix, reborn from the ashes. And so the eagle represents the fulfillment. It's the rose. The eagle and the rose are very much saying the same thing. Yeah.
Here's a quote from the liturgy. We apply reason to the writing on the pages of the book of nature and find there a great truth, that there is a living, personal God, an intelligent, infinite, in wisdom, justice, and beneficent, and that the great law which governs the universe is not a law of mechanics and balancing forces, but a great law of harmony, the will of the Almighty God, always acting as the expression of His infinite and inconceivable love. Can't read my own writing. The forces of nature are the varied actions of God. To me, this means that it's not just about balancing forces, but about harmony, and that Christ is what allows the harmony to happen. Beauty and harmony being synonymous, as we were talking about earlier in the truck. I mean, it's almost a letting it be, just like we were talking about. You have to accept it when you're in that sacrificial phase. That's Cynthia talks about the term metanoia a lot. We talked about that, letting, not participating in the opposing forces.
Cynthia Bourgeot, for your listeners who
Yes,
don't know.
we referenced her enough. They probably all know.
They might, yeah.
And that the way to do that is rolling right into the next topic, which is the new law of love.
Yes.
Love is the way to allow that to happen. And we've covered this topic pretty much throughout the whole program. But then let's just roll right into the new law. Bob says in his book, a Knight Rose Croix should know that the greatest law of all trinities or balance is the law of love. Love in its grandest sense has no opposite, no contrary. In its fullness, it is not merely the sentiment of affection that can be opposed by hate. It is not the feeling of attraction contrasted by fear or disgust. It is not a generosity offset by selfishness. It is not a sense of care and concern challenged by apathy. Love, in its mysterious wholeness, is a light that is perfect, even within the darkest shadows. It is the alchemical secret to the resolution of contraries. It exists outside of duality, and thus transcends duality, right?
That's
that was
right.
my comment on it.
Yeah, you can think of love this way as like pure white light entering a prism. And prism is manifestation, creation, duality. And so all of the colors then are the different ways that we can experience love that we've talked about there. Attraction, care and concern, generosity, all of those dualistic forms of love. Mm-hmm. But each of them leads back to the one white, pure, whole love that contains the potentials of all. And that is not subject to duality. That is divine. And that's why, for example, in 1 John chapter 4, we learn that God is love.
So I had, this is why I wanted to bring my book in, because I have my notes too. And we just mentioned Cynthia in one of her books. She talks about love your neighbor as yourself, and how it's frequently interpreted in one way, but another way is love your neighbor as yourself. You are your neighbor. Mm-hmm. Is like, you can read it that way. We are, period. Yeah. You know, it's not us and them. It's not that separation. Mm-hmm. We are the same. And so I wrote, we aren't just connected to each other. We are each other. Love, this type of love that we're talking about, love binds us in a state of oneness, not separation. Mm-hmm. Oneness which includes God.
Yes. The way we think about reality directs the way we deal with our existence. And if we think about reality only in terms of duality, of divisions and oppositions, then that's the way we make our decisions. Yeah. And everything then is about division and separation and opposition and conflict. But if we recognize that the fundamental nature of reality is God, and God is one, and everything lives and moves and has its being within that divine oneness, then we can start relating to reality as one, and with the intention of experiencing and expressing that oneness rather than division.
Yes.
Rather than opposition. And that's why love is the great reconciler for everything at both the macrocosmic and the microcosmic level.
And to just kind of push forward, we do this occasionally. We tease that this is where we're going to in the 32nd degree.
Yes.
The concept of the reconciliation.
Yes. And the new law of love has such a great relationship with the royal secret. And the royal secret then, of course, prepares us for the holy doctrine. And all of that's what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
and it's going to be unfolded even more as we move forward.
Yeah, and that reconciling the differences is interesting that we had a whole section back here on good and evil. So it hits good and evil in this degree, and then it kind of culminates with the new law of love. And if we believe that we're going to eventually get back to the good, the way we're going to do it, reconcile those two opposites, is through love, and they'll become one.
Love your enemies.
Let's finish with this quote. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, and that ye also loved one another. By this shall all know that ye are my disciples. Let's all do that.
Amen.
Amen. Last words?
I like those.
You know, can't really top that.
Yeah.
All right. Hey, thanks to everybody for joining. We know this was a long one, but it's an important degree. There's a lot of stuff there to learn. We will see you on the 19th degree. Caritas.